Welcome to this episode of Talking Foreign Affairs with Adil. I'm Adil Cader, your host and the Kennedy School Alumni Ambassador for Western Australia. This is a series where I take an interesting perspective through interviewing key figures in the arena of foreign affairs and diplomacy. In today's episode, we will be talking about international cooperation and diplomacy through space. It would be an understatement to say that I've been looking forward to this for a long time. My guest today is one who has an inspirational journey and someone who is full of visionary leadership. I'm pleased to be joined by Mr. Charles Bolden. Mr. Bolden was the 12th Administrator of NASA, and that too a monumental appointment in being the first African American to serve in this capacity. Among his many highlights during his term in office, he oversaw the transition from the Space Shuttle system to a new era of exploration focused on the International Space Station and aeronautics technology development. He also helped to expand NASA's international relationships, a topic we'll be talking about today. Prior to this, he served 34 years in the Marine Corps and worked in NASA's astronaut office, during which he traveled into orbit 4 times and logged over 680 hours in space. He piloted 2 of those missions and commanded the other 2. Even after leaving his post at NASA, Mr. Bolden continued to share his leadership and expertise. As a State Department Science Envoy for Space, and currently as the CEO of the Bolden Consulting Group. Mr. Bolden, thank you so much for joining us.
Adele, it's great to be with you, and please call me Charlie.
Sure thing. Let's start off with a question I'm sure you get asked many times wherever you visit, and I'm sure a lot of the kids who dream of being astronauts ask you, when you're up, what's it like being in space and seeing the world from afar, that view?
I try to explain to kids the experience in terms of 2 senses. One is the sense of feel, the other one is the sense of sight or vision. And the sense of feel comes from the fact that we're going around Earth once every 90 minutes, so about 25,000 kilometers an hour, which means it takes you, an hour and a half to go around the planet. So you have 45 minutes of daylight, 45 minutes of darkness. But that speed causes this force that they've heard of before, but they never thought about it, I don't think, called centrifugal force. And it's pulling us outward, trying to beat gravity, trying to pull you out and make you free of gravity. But gravity holds on. And so you tend to feel like you're floating. In fact, scientifically, you're constantly trying to fall back to Earth. Centrifugal force won't let you. So you're caught in the middle. That is a phenomenal feeling. It gives you the opportunity to actually do experiments to test Newton's laws of motion, because with gravity taken out of the, you can take your food and put it in midair, remove your hand, and it stays right there. You can take your finger and touch it, and it starts to drift across the cabin. So you get to see, a body at rest tends to stay at rest. A body in motion tends to stay in motion, or either for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. If you go over to the keyboard, press on a key without holding on to something, you press on the key and you go the other way. So that's the feel sense. The other one, which is the one that you alluded to first, is it's actually something that I don't think can be repeated anywhere else, and it's the vision. It's looking at the planet from the vantage point of space and seeing this incredible place where we live and all of its beauty and grandeur. There is no ugly part of planet Earth. We live down here on the planet, and so we see stuff up close and we think about things as ugly or whatever else, but not from space. From space, it's just this glorious looking, beautiful planet full of colors and everything vibrant. And the human eye sees things that a camera can't. So we haven't been able to catch the true vision that we see with the human eye with any camera yet. The IMAX camera does a pretty good job. There's some others, but those are the 2 things that really set spaceflight apart from any experience I think that people have here on the planet.
And that perspective of seeing the world as a whole, I know a game you play when doing presentations is try and guess where the border is. Seeing the word as borderless and coming back to Earth, how does that perspective change the way you've gone about your various roles, especially within building international alliances? Because that's very unique insight, seeing the world with no borders and challenging your thinking of borders. How does that impact the way you've about using NASA diplomacy?
I had already been in the Marine Corps for, I want to say before I flew my first flight, I had already been in the Marine Corps for almost 20 years, 18 years when I flew my first flight. And I had traveled around the planet on the ground. And I had gotten to meet people in a lot of different countries. So I knew instinctively that there really is no difference among us. Maybe cultural things, but essentially we're all the same. Having an opportunity to view the planet from the perspective of space, where you saw the absence of borders and boundaries, and that's really what we choose to define us here on the planet. We always talk about borders, and we always talk about walls and ways to divide people. That you don't see that from outer space, and so it kind of arrests the myth that that countries are dramatically different, or that countries are set apart and everything. You realize that we're all a part of one big planet, and that whatever we do in one place actually affects what we do everywhere. Talk about the atmosphere as an example. In this era where we're much more conscious about the changing climate or global warming or whatever, pollution in the oceans, ocean, I call it, because Earth's a big water planet. And one thing that becomes apparent almost immediately upon getting to orbit is there are not a lot of different oceans the way we're taught when we grow up. We live on this big water planet, and on that body of water, there are these big bodies of land, little bodies of land, but they're bodies of land that poke up in the ocean of Earth. And the big ones we call continents, 7 of them. The smaller ones we call islands, and some of them, that at one time were islands because of the rising sea level, disappear, probably never to be seen again. So you get the feeling that if I do something bad in a part of the ocean that's off the east coast of the United States, eventually, because of the currents, that same pollution or whatever it is eventually going to get everywhere else in the world. You think about putting coffee in your cup or tea in your cup. If it's powdered tea and you drop it in there, initially it kind of settles to the bottom. The powder settles to the bottom, and you have some clear water. But when you take a spoon and stir it, winds, ocean currents, otherwise, eventually it all becomes the same color, and it all becomes one solution. And that's the same way our oceans are. The same way with the atmosphere. The atmosphere is a fluid, just like the ocean. It's just a big term for some people and for the kids in the audience. It's less viscous, so the atmosphere is not quite as thick as water, but still it's just like water. And you put something into one part of the atmosphere, eventually the winds will blow it such that it gets around the globe.
And you talk about being interconnected and saying, apart from minor cultural differences, we're all really connected. And I think that really did stand out during your term as NASA Administrator. But I just want to go prior to that, because I was watching an interview and you were saying your fondest memories of the 14 years in the space program prior to being administrator was actually not literally in space. It was actually when you were training with Sergei Krylov and Miss Vladimir Titov. And because obviously we talk about the context of the Cold War and becoming friends with the family, becoming friends with them. Just explain what that was like, because Cold War, things being intense, what was that like?
Well, it's important for the audience to understand that I essentially, as an adult, I grew up as a Marine, as a warfighter. And, when I was born, we had just come out of World War II. Before I even got to elementary school, we were back into war and then as I got to high school, we were in war in Vietnam. So we're just kind of a warring people. We for some reason, we get engaged in combat in an effort to try to solve problems. So when I was given the opportunity to leave Washington, D.C., where I was serving for about a year as the assistant deputy administrator at NASA, given an opportunity to go back and fly, and I found out that they wanted me to command the first Russian-American mission, my initial response was, forget it. No way. I don't want to fly with any Russian, because I trained all my life as a Marine to kill them, and they trained all their lives to kill me. And my boss at the time kind of calmed me down. He said, hey, why don't you go meet the people before you pass judgment? And we met that night, Sergei Krylov and Vladimir Titov, the 2 Russian cosmonauts who we actually moved to the United States from Moscow with their families. And that first night, all we talked about was our families, and we talked about our children, and our vision for the future, what we, the kind of world that we would like to see them be able to grow up in. And I kind of left that just several hour evening of dinner and friendship, and I went back and said, hey, I'm all in. And over the next 2 years, involved in training with the two of them, getting an opportunity to fly with Sergey, and then at the end, going to Russia for the first time in my life, taking my wife and my daughter, and having an opportunity to spend a couple of weeks over there with them, get a firsthand look at the Russian culture, the beauty of its history and everything else, and the wonderful nature of its people. Again, I was reminded that we're really all the same, and we all want the same thing. We want peace and tranquility. We want to be able to live happily and take care of our families and our kids and everything. And so that's why I say that 2-year period of time that gave not just me, but it gave my wife, my son, my daughter, and all of us who are engaged in astronaut program down in Houston, an opportunity to meet with people who were dramatically different from us culturally, but much the same as us as human beings, wanting the same kinds of things and putting the same kind of effort into making the world a better place.
And do you feel those relationships built through NASA actually have a reverberation through the general diplomatic relationships between the countries?
Without a doubt. I had an opportunity to meet Secretary John Kerry, who is now President Biden's environmental ambassador or environmental envoy. When he was the Secretary of State for President Obama, we happened to end up in Moscow at the same time. Scott Kelly, the American astronaut, had just come back from his 1-year mission, and he and his crewmate were doing part of their post-flight in Russia. And so I had an opportunity. Secretary Kerry asked me to come to his hotel and just have coffee with him one morning. And it was a long night for him because he had been up all night negotiating with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and President Putin, and it had not gone well. And so he was experiencing some frustration. So when I went in for the cup of coffee, he looked at me and he said, I got a question. He said, how the hell do you do it? And I said, Mr. Secretary, how do I do what? He said, how do you get along with these people so well? How do you all forge such friendships in the space program? And we can't even talk to people diplomatically and politically right now. And I explained to him that we were all dedicated and focused on a mission, on a common mission, and a common goal to try to make the planet better for all humanity. And that it was personal for us. We knew each other very personally for years. We had become lifelong friends and everything. And I said, I thought that was critically important. So, I tell people all the time, I think one of America's major soft power tools is NASA. The State Department, obviously, the DOD, the military, America's military, believe it or not, is an incredible soft power tool. And it's because of things that they do, like outreach with special forces that go into sometimes very hostile countries to try to help people learn how to farm and how to make clean drinking water and just things like that. So the Department of Defense, the Department of State, NASA, and other organizations, but I think NASA is one of America's foremost soft power tools.
And I find it quite fascinating as well, the dependency between the US and Russia. And if I'm not mistaken, depending on the US for the Russian Soyuz to transport astronauts to and forth, and Russia wanting to put a machine on Mars and having to depend on Curiosity. So there is that natural dependence which forces both agencies to work together.
Yes, and you cited several examples. After we lost Columbia, and we decided that we were going to phase out of the shuttle from that time, about 10 years. We needed to find a way to speed the completion of the International Space Station. And NASA decided that if they could devote each of the shuttle crew members, and that's a crew of 7, you could have as many as 5 spacewalkers. We could probably speed the completion of the International Space Station if we dedicated the entire shuttle crew to construction of station and relied on Russians with the Soyuz to take crew members, 3 crew members at a time, who would actually live and work on station and run the space station while we were finishing out the build out. And so that's what we did for the next 10, 15 years, to be quite honest, while we developed commercial space capability, or like we have now. We now use the SpaceX Crew Dragon. We're hoping that Boeing will fly their CST-100 here in a few months on its first test flight. Its second test flight, actually, but that they'll successfully complete that and then have an opportunity to fly their first human demo. And then they'll become the second commercial vehicle that can carry humans to space and rid us of the complete reliance on Russia to get our astronauts to and from space. That doesn't mean we'll stop working with them at all, because our hope here at NASA, and I think the Russians at Roscosmos agree with us, our hope is that we will continue to use 3 vehicles to get humans to space, train crew members to be able to fly on any of them, so that while the crew is on station, if something untoward happens and we have to get the crews back home, anybody can get in any vehicle and come back. They'll be trained and capable to fly any of the 3 vehicles that should be available by then.
And on the note of the International Space Station, one thing I always find very fascinating is that how you mentioned that it's the United Nations of space and how it should be up for a Nobel Peace Prize. Do you think there's a possibility that more countries can join the International Space Station in the future? Do you think the ability to join is limited by a country's capacity? Only certain countries would be able to have the capacity to join?
No, I think more and more countries will join will do work on the International Space Station. If you look at what goes on today, Israel has a presence there. They've never had a crew member who's actually spent an increment on station, but they, through companies like Space Pharma and Aleph Farms, they actually have experimentation that's ongoing on station constantly. The UAE became the first Arab nation to actually have a crew member serve on the International Space Station when the UAE astronauts went up and spent about 2 weeks there, had gone up in a Soyuz spacecraft and stayed and then came back. And currently we're working with a number of what President Obama coined as non-traditional partners. The Middle Eastern countries, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, maybe even more, trying to work with India, continually working with our partners in Japan and other places. And I tend to be a little bit out of the mainstream, but I really hold hope that we'll find a way to collaborate with China and bring the Chinese into the human part of the International Space Station. We've already flown Chinese experiments through an American company called NanoRacks that was able to take some Chinese experiments, but I'd like to see us expand it. It'll be a challenge, but so was flying with the Russians. That they were once our bitterest of enemies, and in some ways they kind of still are, but we work collaboratively on the International Space Station. I think we can do the same thing with the Chinese.
And you mentioned that note of the Chinese, and obviously one big limiting factor is the 2011 Wolf Amendment, which prevents the bilateral workings between both the US and China. Do you think that will be overturned anytime soon, or do you think there's still opportunity, as you said, to build the relationships with China through a multilateral forum like the International Space Station, and hopefully thawing relationships in the near future to bring those 2 countries together?
Yeah, I'm not sure that overturning the Wolf Amendment is necessary. The Wolf Amendment has been successfully modified through the years such that it, unlike people generally speak, it's not a strict prohibition against bilateral activity between China and the US. What it stipulates is that before we engage in any bilateral activities with them, we will notify Congress. We will give them certification that we have gone through the intelligence agencies, that we can guarantee that no one with whom we're going to work or speak while we're doing engaged has been engaged in terrorist activities or in violations of human rights. That is a tall order for the Chinese, particularly because of the abuses of the Rohingya and Muslims in parts of China. but it's still possible. I mean, we did it with the Russians, and so we should be able to do it with the Chinese again. But even with the Wolf Amendment in place, I think there is the possibility that we can begin to work with the Chinese much in human spaceflight as we do today in aeronautics or certain areas of aeronautics like traffic management, but also like we do with the Chinese in areas of geodetics, looking at earthquakes. We have they're partners in a Severe that NASA and the U.S. Agency for International Development Fund that does work around the world in crop development, water resources management, disaster planning and relief. And the Chinese are a part of our team in Severe in the Himalayas. So it's headquartered out of an environmental center in Kathmandu. And we have worked cooperatively with the Chinese there for a number of years now.
So on China, and I know you really don't like the term space race. As you said, with the term space race, it means once you win the race, what you do next. You like looking at things that solve solutions to concerns about humanity. But do you think there is a risk where there can be an arms race in outer space, and what's the best way to prevent that?
Well, I tell you, Adil, I'm not sure that we've not already engaged, become engaged in an arms race in outer space. I think if you look at U.S. Space Force as an example, when you listen to General Raymond talk, the commander of the U.S. Space Force, he still says his job is trying to find a way to work collaboratively with other nations of the world, be they allies or enemies. And I think everybody realizes the dramatic impact, negative impact of actually conducting particularly kinetic warfare in space. The fact that what it does if you engage in kinetic warfare is you pretty much take everybody away from the capability of operating in that particular orbit where you've had kinetic activity take place. So I think we're trying to approach the competition in space as smartly as we can, and my hope is that nations will continue to look for conventions, if not laws and regulations that limit what can be done in outer space. It depends on, when I went over to China for my visits under President Obama, we had 3 principles that we talked about all the time. And in order for us to collaborate, both nations had to agree that we would hold to the principles of transparency, reciprocity, and mutual benefit. And I think if you can reach a gentleman's agreement, if you will, that both nations will try their best to adhere to those principles, then there's hope that we can work collaboratively together.
And you spoke of those bilateral principles, and also alluded to earlier in regards to multilateral institutions. Do you think the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space is taking the lead on this in the right way, or do you think it's up to the agencies as a whole, specifically NASA and the other powerful agencies around the world, to set the tone?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. UN agencies work, but they work at an incredibly snail's pace. So I think what the work of UN COPUOS is critical when they look at things like orbital debris, debris removal and debris mitigation, whether or not it's looking at new emerging space law to determine rights to assets or resources that are found in space, whether it be on the moon or on asteroids or Mars or whatever. That work is critically important, and it goes on as the agencies work together to try to formulate conventions under which they can work. So I think it's a combination of a lot of different organizations, the UN through COPUOS, the military through their negotiations and treaties and everything, and NASA working with our sister agencies in nations around the world.
And on that note, getting out of this notion of the space race and bringing this human need. I know if you look at the Apollo 11, even though that was born out of a need to beat the Soviets, would you agree as well that there was a win for humanity? Because in one of his speeches, You highlighted how there was celebration all over the world. There was excitement by the Queen of England, by the Prime Minister of India, the Pope were all excited that even though it was an American that landed on the moon and put the flag, it was a win for humanity. And when I think of that, I think of the time that Muhammad Ali beat George Foreman in the Rumble in the Jungle. No one really cared. No, even if you want American, people were just in awe of the human triumph of that event. And when I think of the Apollo 11 landing, that's what I reminisce of.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all. I think that's exactly what happened. People tend to miss the part in President Kennedy's address or addresses when he talked about getting to the moon. He also, the second part of his presentation was peaceful collaboration among nations. He was a peacemaker. He was a person who his entire career sought to bring nations together. And he talked about the critical importance of using space and science and technology to try to bring people together. And nobody ever talks about his search for world peace in each of those speeches that he made about going to the moon and the like. So
the other one at the Rice University?
The one at Rice University, but he also included it in his speech to the U.S. Congress. So, and I think people generally tend to miss that part.
And on the note of working together in peaceful means, we look at the issue of planetary defense. Do you think that'll become a big issue which will force countries to work together in this notion?
That is, I think, my hope, and the hope of many of us is that that we will find that the threat that the environment or global warming or whatever you want to call it, the threat that it poses for humanity, not for the planet, but for humanity. The planet will be okay. It's us, it's human beings that won't make it if we're not smart and we don't stop doing things that endanger our environment. So I think continuing to work in that regard is critically important for us.
And I'm quite keen to know your thoughts as well in regards to the collaboration with private companies like SpaceX. Do you think there'll be a time where the company's importance in space growth will outgrow those of the roles of agencies like NASA?
I don't. And that doesn't bother me at all. I think if you talk to anybody in companies like SpaceX or Blue Origin, any of them, they'll tell you that the partnership with NASA has been critically important, because NASA, as the government representative, we still assume both financial and human risk or programmatic risk way out in front of the private sector. A lot of the technologies that are used by the private companies came from prior NASA research or research on the part of government agencies. And interestingly, SpaceX wouldn't even be around today were it not for an infusion of funds from NASA as we began to move into the commercial space initiative with our what we used to call COTS, Commercial Orbital Transportation System. So that infusion of funds was necessary to enable SpaceX to continue to move along in development of the Falcon 9, which today is arguably the most reliable, low to medium lift vehicle on the planet.
One thing that I found really interesting is your push for outreach and to build international relations across the world through NASA as a soft power diplomatic tool. One thing you sought out to do was to reach out to areas in the Middle East and to help them recognize about their historic contribution to science, maths, and engineering. What made this a priority for you?
Well, it was a priority for the president. So, and I worked for President Obama, but as a person of color, with my ancestors having come from across the Atlantic, say in Africa as they had come, they were not unconnected to the nations in the Middle East. The trade routes that went from Africa into the Middle East since time began were really important. The fact that that, a lot of the math and science that we use today, a lot of the physics and math originated in the Middle East. And I thought it was critically important, not just for the people of the Middle East, particularly young men. My focus was really on the young men in the Middle East to try to find an alternative to jihadism. If we could get them interested in science and math and engineering, technical things, maybe they would turn their attention away from just destruction because of their feeling of hopelessness, that they would turn their attention toward doing constructive things. Great example is the success of the UAE Space Agency and the Mohammed bin Rashid Research Center in getting the Emirates Mars mission, the Hope probe, to Mars. The unfortunate thing is that about 80% of the science team is women, because men in that region just up until now didn't have an interest in science. Those who did have an academic interest, it was either in business or it was in petroleum engineering. But now, as they're trying to convert from an oil economy to a knowledge economy, young men are finding that science is not that bad, science and math and engineering. And so our hope is that their entrance into the family of spacefaring nations, their thunderous entrance, if you will, with the Hope mission, will cause young men to begin to get interested in what can be done in terms of space exploration also. Same thing in Saudi Arabia. It's hard to think of a Middle Eastern nation today that's not at least making some effort to convert from being oil economies to knowledge economies, and getting young men and women interested will be essential if they're going to be successful in that.
And you mentioned as well how it was Obama's foreign policy priorities, and follows off from his New Beginnings speech in Cairo. And from that, he tried to increase this between NASA and other countries with space programs in the Middle East. How enriching are those exchanges in building knowledge, not just at those space agencies in the Middle East, but at NASA as well?
Well, I think it's critical. When you use the term enriching, I think it brings great value to the countries themselves. Again, when you look at if I use the UAE's accomplishment, both in having their first astronaut followed very quickly with the Mars mission, it has brought them great recognition from their sister countries in the Middle East, as well as from countries around the world. I mean, the accolades poured in with the successful entry into Mars orbit by the Hope probe, not unlike what happened in America when we successfully landed humans on the moon. So I think the world regales in accomplishments of humanity, no matter where it happens to be, when it's something the way that the Hope probe did. That's a huge deal. People were equally, although not as, because China had already done some pretty important things, pretty impressive things, like they're landing on the backside of the moon. That was a significant accomplishment. So, but they've been in the space business for much longer than the UAE. I think the reason that the UAE got so much attention was because not very many people knew, first of all, that they were engaged in such activity. And then people were surprised that a small Middle Eastern nation could accomplish something that heretofore only 3 other big nations had been able to do.
And on the point of when you're reaching out to the Middle East, I know there was some criticism back home. How was it like dealing with the criticism at the time and still kind of going ahead with the goal you set out to do?
It was interesting because in my case, I ignored it, which did not make my coworkers at NASA very happy. They thought that we should get active in trying to combat the criticism. But as a person of African descent, or as a Black man, I learned a long time ago, I'm not going to talk anybody into liking me. I don't care how much I talk. I'm not going to be able to change people's minds. What I have to do is perform and let my performance speak for me, and then see if they find the value in having me as a part of the team. That's the same thing that we wanted to do for for the Middle Eastern countries. We wanted them to perform in order to become an effective and recognized member of the family of spacefaring nations. And I don't think there's anyone who can argue that that's exactly what the UAE did.
And on that note of diversity and challenge, do you think there's still more space for diversity in astronauts around the world?
Oh, incredible. There is always space, until we have representation from every nation in the world that wants to be a part of the family of spacefaring nations. We should never stop trying to go out and inform people of the opportunities that are there and trying to find a way to give them the opportunity to take part. The greatest part about, I was the reluctant, I guess I would call myself the healthy skeptic about commercial spaceflight when I came in as the NASA administrator. There were people in the Obama administration who really did not want me to be the NASA administrator because they felt that with my connection to shuttle that I would do everything in my power to keep us from moving on away from shuttle and into using commercially available vehicles. And in a way they were right. I was wedded to shuttle, but I had not locked out the possibility of relying on commercially produced vehicles. I was just a healthy skeptic that we could bring them along as rapidly as everybody thought. I knew we couldn't because spaceflight's hard, and building spacecraft that are going to be safe for human beings is very difficult. So I just wanted to make sure we did it right. I had a conversation with, I remember Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon, and he and Gene Cernan, who was the last man to stand on the moon, and Jim Lovell, who was the commander of Apollo 13. The three of them came to a congressional hearing the year after we made the announcement that we were going to phase shuttle out and we were going to begin to work to support to facilitate the success of commercial launch vehicles. They all testified before Congress against our decision. And Neil was not quite as forceful in his testimony. He was a great engineer. And when he and I would talk, he said, look, I'm not opposed to commercial spacecraft. I just want to make sure we do it right. And I want to make sure that our engineering is sound and that the processes that we use to develop those spacecraft are as stringent as we did in the days of Apollo when we worked with industry, because industry built our vehicles. But we worked diligently with them to make sure that we had vehicles that were going to be as safe as possible. And so I kind of adopted Neil's attitude, that I'm not opposed at all. I just want to make sure we do it right. And I think we did. I think we worked extra hard to facilitate the success of the commercial space industry. And I think you can see it today in the work of SpaceX and companies like Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin, who hopefully will fly a human soon, and Boeing. So I think our ability to accept the risk paid off. It's still dangerous. There is no question there, and we will still lose vehicles and people. But we've got to understand the risk of what we're doing and continually pursue making it as good as we can at every turn.
And on that note of, as we spoke about increasing diversity and more countries getting involved, do you think any country is ready to send humans into space at a point, or is it something that countries would have to have a certain capability to do so?
If you mean, is any country capable of building their own spacecraft to
humans into space?
That's a tall order, and I don't think, that's not something you can just will. I could be wrong. For example, I don't think the UAE, even having demonstrated what they did, I don't think that they have the assets. They have the intellectual capital, but I don't think that they have the assets that they want to divert from doing the kind of scientific research and exploration that they are now embarked on. I think it would be a mistake for them to go off and try to stand up their own human spaceflight program. In fact, I consult for one of America's commercial companies that's trying to help other nations and the private sector to select, train, and fly astronauts, a company called Axiom Space. But I think that's the vehicle that I would hope many of the smaller nations will take, working with companies that have the capability to get people to space, like SpaceX, like Axiom, like Virgin Galactic, like Blue Origin, work with them to help train their astronauts and then have a program that's there that they call their own for human spaceflight, but not get diverted into into spending the assets on trying to produce their own launch program and their own vehicles. Granted, there's a certain amount of pride in being able to do that, but in the long run, what you're trying to do is get your own astronauts into space to do things that are going to benefit humanity back here. And you can do that no matter how you get there. It's just, I would suggest they partner with some of the spacefaring nations that have already made that investment and go with it.
And related to that note of the capability, one thing I do find interesting is you have a quiz sometimes in one of your lectures when you deliver to colleges. You ask, how many countries have sent a human being on the moon? And so that's a trick question. There's only one in the US. But as we focus on the moon, because I know the US is focusing on getting a person on the moon by 2024, but looking at Mars, given the physical challenges of putting a human on Mars, how vital is it that we have countries working together on that? And do you think that the people landing on the moon will be people from different countries?
Two questions. One, the first one, if you talk about Mars, I think Mars is incredibly difficult and expensive. And we need as many diverse ideas as we can get for how you safely get humans there. And I think that speaks to the need to make it an international effort. If the U.S. wants to go, there's an African proverb said that if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, then you take others with you. And I think we want to go far. We really want to get humans to Mars safely, be able to set up temporary habitats there, do research, and then return safely to Earth. I think that requires an international effort. I don't think any single company or any single country can do that. Not safely anyway, and effectively. Getting back to the moon, that's something the U.S. could do alone, but I don't think it wise for us to try to venture off and do it alone when in fact there are so many other nations that have great ideas about getting there, can add to the technology that's needed to get there and can participate. So I would prefer to see that the next crew that goes back to the moon is a crew of internationals, not just Americans.
And as we approach time, one final question I have to ask. You've spoken about your favorite moment before you were NASA Administrator. I'm quite keen to know, what was your favorite moment as NASA Administrator, and what's your funniest story being in space?
I don't know that I have a funniest story being in space. My funny things happen here on the planet. For example, when I learned about something that's called Hoots Law, and it was when I killed my crew in the simulator one day. We were doing a launch simulation, Ascent Sim, and I was really struggling to learn all the systems on shuttle. And I'd actually gone into my commander, Hoot Gibson, and told him I didn't think I was ever going to learn all this stuff. And he smiled and he said, "Hey, look, we have all been there. It happens to all of us. Shuttle is really complex and there's a lot of stuff to learn, but just keep at it and it'll come. The light bulb's going to come on one day." And he was absolutely right. But in the course of doing that, we were in the simulator, as I said, one day, and I really wanted to impress my crew, to give them confidence in their pilot. And we lifted off, and almost immediately we got an alarm that we had an electrical system failure. And so I looked over on all the panels and the displays, and I diagnosed that we had an essential bus failure that had caused one of our three main engines to shut down, because that fed electrical power to the engine, critical electrical power. So I diagnosed it. I looked over at Hoot and I said, "Hoot, I think we have an essential 1 BC failure. I'm going to work the bus isolation procedure." And that's where you took the bad bus off the line so that if there was a short, it didn't short out another one and cause you to lose another engine. And Hoot he didn't look at me. He just said, "Okay, Roger." And I reached over to the panel and put my finger on the switch for the circuit that I thought was the bad one that I wanted to isolate, and shut it off. And all of a sudden, boom, it got really quiet in the cockpit. I had shut down a working electrical bus to a second engine and had taken out I had taken out the second engine. And so, after the solid rocket boosters separated in the simulator, the vehicle just kind of rolled over and started falling back into the Atlantic Ocean. And after we landed in the ocean and died, figuratively, Hoot put his hand on my left shoulder and he looked over at me and he said, "Charles?" And I knew I was in trouble. And the way he said it, he said, "Did I ever tell you Hoot's Law?" And I said, "Hoot, no, you did not." I was real sheepish. He said, "Well, it goes like this. No matter how bad things are, you can always make them worse." And so after that, we came up with a rule that no matter how bad things were, we would always put two sets of eyes, two crew members, on determining what the problem really was. Shuttle was so complicated with so many redundant systems that it was easy at times to misdiagnose and take an action that would actually take down a good system. So that became Hoot's Law in action. And every one of my flights from then on, that was a rule that I had on my crew, was that no one person does anything until at least two sets of eyes have looked at the problem and agreed. And if we can talk to the ground, we have time to talk to the ground, let's bring them in and let them help us before we take any action, because there's nothing you need to do in shuttle so quickly that you don't have time to do it right. So that was one thing. I think my favorite is the NASA Administrator. It wasn't me, but we had a program called Morpheus. It was an experimental lunar lander. It was methane powered. So we were trying to develop this lunar lander that would use methane instead of conventional rocket fuels and the like. And we had brought together a team of very young engineers and scientists from all over the country, all over the NASA centers, brought them together at the Johnson Space Center, and they worked on developing this system. And they went through it. It was great. Everything was working, all their tests. And so they finally decided, okay, it's time to go down to the Kennedy Space Center so we can launch this thing and fly a couple of test flights with it and make sure that the technology works. And I followed it because I was just enamored with the way that they brought this disparate team together with all these different ideas. And we had proven that you didn't need to be a seasoned engineer to make a contribution. And so the day that they were going to launch Untethered, Aviation Week and Space Technology was there. NBC News, the media was there to cover the launch of Morpheus, this prototype lunar lander. And they went through the countdown and 3, 2, 1, lift off, and Morpheus lifted off and rolled over and crashed and burned and died. And I was watching it on NASA closed circuit TV, and I immediately got on the phone to the project manager, a guy named John Olanson. And I said, "Hey, John, do me a favor." I said, "Bad day, but that's okay. Let your guys kind of mourn for a while, but then tell them I'm really proud of them, that they at least, had the guts to go try this thing. And that we all knew that it was single string. We didn't have any backups. We didn't have any redundancies. It's really important now, though, that we kind of pick up the wreckage, find out what went wrong and fix it so that we can fly successfully." So that little mission, that little project was the one about which I felt the most proud, because they did exactly that. They kind of dusted themselves off, went back, figured out what had gone wrong, fixed it, and successfully flew. And today, a lot of the work that we're doing on getting ready to send things to the lunar surface uses a lot of the technologies that were developed in the Morpheus project. So that was probably my proudest moment as the NASA Administrator, was watching one of our teams fail, but then recover from it.
Charlie, thank you so much for this interview and this opportunity. It was such an insightful interview and a discussion, hearing about your insights on international cooperation, the amazing work you did in building partnerships with other countries, and your general vision and leadership. Thank you so much for taking the time out today.
Well, Adele, thank you so very much. And I look forward post-COVID to maybe getting to Perth, since I've never been there, get to the other side of
West Coast. One of the advantages of being here, because our beach is the sun sets into the sea. So It's much better than the East Coast where the sun sets. And I am quite biased in telling this, but the West Coast beaches are much better than the East Coast beaches.
That's what I've heard. So I look forward to visiting you sometime down the road.